We've pivoted instead to China as an existential threat to the global economy.
Donald Trump often use a sledgehammer when what's needed is a scalpel.
The United States, its financial system, the dollar are indispensable to the global economy. That's simply not the case anymore.
I still perceive the Americans as overall more realistic than the Europeans who live again on a planet that's even further away from reality land than America. I mean, in America, and even among the neocons, who do have this most belligerent of all like worldviews, there are a certain key fixtures of, for instance, trying to get the economy back on track. And now part of the whole tariff idea by Donald Trump, part of it is, of course, the wish to improve the U.S. economy and to bring manufacturing back to the U.S., which by itself is a laudable goal, I would say. The question is this the way to implement it? How do you think the tariffs are going to help, or is this self-destructive?
Well, I think the flippant answer is that it's self-destructive. Again, this reflects the failure of execution in spite of Trump's good intentions, because you're quite right. The middle class in the United States has borne the brunt of an egregiously mismanaged global monetary system. And I would characterize where we are today as sort of the end of the Bretton Woods era. I recently wrote a Substack addressing this. We're not in 1944. We're not in 1971 when we came off the gold standard. And we're not in 2008 when we had the subprime mortgage meltdown. We're in all three combined. The entire global financial system is unwinding. The dollar as the world reserve currency, I don't think is long for this world. Along comes Donald Trump in an attempt, if you will, to represent that battered middle class. But what does he want to do? He wants to protect and retrench the dollar as the world reserve currency. And unfortunately, this is weaponization of the dollar by other means. That's what tariffs ultimately are. And I think this is an egregious missed opportunity, because when Trump came in, not only was this an opportunity to reset relationships with the Russians, among other powers in the international community, but it was an opportunity to renegotiate a global financial system that has changed beyond recognition and doesn't really work for anybody anymore, whether it's the Chinese or the United States, average households in America and Europe. And instead of assuming that course, in other words, instead of sort of renegotiating in good faith with countries like China that I think want to participate in a new system as a reliable business partner, what has he done? He's targeted the PBOC, the People's Bank of China, the Chinese Communist Party in general, as an enemy, right? So as opposed to, I would say, the Biden administration, which was obsessed with painting Putin as a dictatorial figure that would destroy the rules-based order, we've pivoted instead to China as an existential threat to the global economy and the villain that is responsible for subverting and undermining the interests of average households in the United States. And that simply is not the case. But if you see the world from that vantage point, instead of the internal reforms that we need to do in the United States, fixing our fiscal deficit, which is $2 or $3 trillion year over year, imposing structural reforms to our entitlement spending, gutting our defense budget, things that we desperately need. What are we doing? We're pinning the blame on the Chinese, and we're using tariffs to do it. And it's not a surprise to me whatsoever that they're backfiring. In other words, just to briefly summarize the point here, what goes on in Beijing or Moscow or Tehran, that's not the principal threat to American households. What goes on in Washington, D.C., New York City, and to a lesser extent, Jerusalem, that's the problem. And that hasn't changed with the election of Donald Trump.
Why, though, does Donald Trump, and to a lesser extent also other administrations, often use what I perceive, as a sledgehammer, um, when what's needed is a scalpel in order to work on foreign policy? Because, like, let's take the tariffs. Tariffs are a legitimate means of states to safeguard certain sectors and industries. Let's take the Japanese. Part of the electoral base of the ruling party in Japan of the LDP is farmers, the rural areas, and in order to make sure that these people have can make a livelihood, the Japanese protect the rice industry. So imports get tariffs, rice imports, and also different kind of produce, like agricultural produce from the outside, are selectively tariffed. That's a scalpel, right? Donald Trump just says like tariffs for everybody, 10% minimum, 20, 25, 40 on everything from the outside. And there are, of course, products on the outside that the United States can even produce. A friend of mine has a green tea company, like exporting Japanese green tea to the United States. And, Japanese green tea, just by the fact of what it is, can't be grown in the United States. Why the sledgehammer approach instead of the scalpel?
This is the meat and bones of what's wrong with the Trump administration. Let's start with phenomenology. Whenever I sort of explain what's happening to non-Americans like yourself, what's going on in Washington D.C. or New York City or places like that, we have to start with the frame of reference. Donald Trump and his team, and if you read their statements, whether it's the America First investment policy, which you can read on the White House website, or it's Stephen Mirren, who is the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors to the president. They're all echoing a very basic claim, and that is that the United States, its financial system, the dollar, are indispensable to the global economy, that ultimately the world needs us more than we need them. And furthermore, if you read Stephen Mirren in particular, he asserts rather, that the world owes us something because it's free riding on U.S. national security guarantees, right? That it depends on the U.S. Navy to actually have a viable trading system for economy to flow around the world. Furthermore, that because 90% of global trade is transacted in dollars, that it's indispensable. The problem with that is that that's simply not the case anymore. The system that we're in today basically requires three components. The first is that the dollar is relatively cheap, so that inflation costs around the world are lesser. Input costs for manufacturers like China are relatively inexpensive. That's the first piece. The second is that U.S. consumers are strong. And the third is that the profits overseas are reinvested in the United States. We are heavily dependent on foreign investment. In other words, there's something like 20 to 30 trillion dollars that are invested in American assets. This reality, it does not appear, has resonated very strongly with Trump and his team. They see quite the opposite. They see a world that depends on American markets, that depends on U.S. consumers, that has to transact in dollars. What we're observing is, actually speaking, that's not really the case. And so the sense is from them, well, they can take a sledgehammer approach because we're still the dominant partner of nations in the world, because the world depends on us, because the dollar, because our banking system are so interlocked in the global trading system, that we can take that blunt approach. Unfortunately, we can't do that anymore. So we have to take a more diplomatic approach. We have to be more precise. That's one component. The other component to this is that he's trying to reset a system. He's trying to fix an imbalance that's built up over decades in about 18 months. Okay. That's not a realistic goal. It's going to take a decade or more for us to fix this. So again, you're back to the same problem that we discussed a moment ago with Ukraine. The war in Ukraine has killed at least 1 million people. I've heard estimates that are as high as 1.5 million or 2 million people, the majority of whom are Ukrainians. Millions more have lost their homes. They've been forced out of Ukraine. They're living in other parts of Europe or other parts of the world. You can't fix that diplomatically or otherwise in a few months. That's going to be a process, a rehabilitation process of months and months, if not years. Donald Trump is trying to accomplish all of this in record time. That works against him. right? But he does not appear to have the temperament nor the frame of reference to apply the kind of precise diplomatic, framework that you're calling upon him to do.